Welcome back. We're going to go ahead and get started. We have three speakers in this session representing different perspectives from industry. The first of those is Russ Ford. Russ is the Executive Vice President for Contracting and Procurement for Royal Dutch Shell. His organization is responsible for worldwide annual spending of $65 billion across Shell's upstream and downstream operations. He was previously the Executive Vice President for Onshore in the Americas, a role that included subsurface engineering, drilling, and production operations. Prior to that, he was responsible for all onshore and offshore development in the Western Hemisphere. He holds a mechanical engineering degree from the University of Michigan, welcome back, and an MBA from Cal State University. And he'll speak to us today about energy scenarios for our future. Russ, welcome back. Thank you.
Good morning. You know, before I came up here, I was reflecting. As Mark said, I graduated with a BSME in 1981, so over 3 decades ago. And if you'd have asked me then if I'd have been standing behind a podium with a great big M on it, close to the Phoenix Center that's now becoming an energy institute that's going to look at transportation and clean energy and maybe even the energy security of our country over 3 decades ago, I'd have said, nah, I don't think so. Either that or go buy me a beer, because I wouldn't have believed either of those things would have been happening. But here we are, 3 decades later, huh? And it's great to be back in Ann Arbor to talk about energy, and actually to share some scenarios with you. Scenarios that I hope are pertinent to our energy future and that you get something out of. In developing these scenarios, we realize that we're faced with a number of paradoxes in addressing our energy future. There's a huge growth in world population and the urbanization of that population and living standards, which is good. But that has to be combined with the stress that growth brings to food systems, to water systems, and to energy systems. There's an increase in humankind's connectivity, which by and large is a good thing, but that comes with a destabilizing effect when some of those connected, sometimes opposing coalitions actually get into a conflict. But through all this, societies evolve, and businesses develop, and people invest. And I'll try to give you a view of the impact of some of these futures on the energy systems, on how we as an energy company will react. Before I get into it, though, our lawyers speak. Our quarter just ended, so I am obliged to tell you that none of what I'm giving is forward-looking information that you should use to invest, as if you didn't already know that. Assuming you've already read that, we'll move on to the bulk of the talk. So why do scenarios? In the energy business, especially these days in the energy business, our investment horizon can span decades. It can be 25 years plus to get the full economic return from multi-billion-dollar investments, of which we have many. So we have an interest in how world events can impact our future. That's why we do the scenarios. Now, the inputs to those scenarios, as it shows on the left, are a broad set of trends in economics, geopolitics, social change, and environmental stresses. These are the realities. This improves our ability to consider a wide range of paths, and that in turn gives us different images of the future. Now, these images of the future give us information we can act on. For instance, around the beginning of the last decade, we saw a yawning gap between the supply of available energy and what the demand was going to be given the growing population. We changed our investment profile to be more heavily weighted towards natural gas and towards biofuels. So we do the scenarios to help ourselves understand what the future is, and it does direct what we want to do as a business. And the inputs I talked about are all signals, really, of a volatile time with many ongoing transitions. In the upper left, it'd be hard to argue that there's a great deal of economic uncertainty on the back of the 2008 financial crisis, with all the political and social instability that brings. Existing multilaterals struggle to reflect the significance of rising economic powers, so new relationships evolve. Just think of the G20 now versus what used to be the G7. The global population will grow, demographics will change, it will grow from 9.5 billion by 2060. From where we stand today, that's a city added every week of 1.3 million people for the next 40 years. And urbanization of that population is going to pack us all more tightly together. So this growth will put food, water, and energy systems under a great deal of stress, while the outlook on the energy mix will change, and it'll change especially in our country. So whether we want it or not, change is going to be inevitable. So what might some scenarios look like? Here's two that we've developed. One's called mountains, and one is called oceans. We describe the change that I just described in these two archetypes. These archetypes are built around plausible assumptions on political, environmental, social, and economic conditions. And basically, they're done for our purposes to model what the future energy landscape might look like. First, let's talk about mountains. This scenario assumes structures and institutions of power are quite stable, they stay rigid, and they stay unreformed. And that slows collective decision-making, and it also slows economic growth. Fast emerging economies struggle to implement structural, financial, economic, and legal reforms and fall into a middle income trap. With very few power brokers in this structure, bilateral relationships and progress is possible, but really in secondary policy areas. For example, with economic disappointment and resource stresses in cities in the future, some of these interests align, enabling smart, compact cities to manage water shortages or the growth of new and advanced technologies. So there will be winners and losers based on successful relationships or the lack thereof. So the metaphor for mountains is also appropriate. There are some peaks, but there are also some lows. Now, how does mountains predict the energy future will look? Well, first of all, the moderated pace of economic development really relaxes some of the supply and demand pressures that we might otherwise face. And also, resource-efficient infrastructures like compact cities help. In this way, mountains produces conditions that enable a shift in global transportation and infrastructure. Vehicle electrification, the use of natural gas for vehicles, and hydrogen all play a role. Mountains also explores energy supply-side possibilities, with increased natural resources like shale gas extending far beyond what we see in North America. With supportive policy frameworks in place, natural gas is enabled as the backbone of the global energy system by the 2030s, accounting for more energy production on an equivalent basis than any other source. Environmentally, CO2 is moderated by a slower overall economic growth, by the substitution of coal for cleaner natural gas, and the early successful deployment of carbon capture and storage, or CCS. In contrast to the peaks and lows of mountains, oceans predicts a more consistent growth pattern across the globe. There's a growing population, but increased economic empowerment creates a climate where compromise is recognized as a key driver of progress. Reforms unleash new productivity and growth. Economies are able to maintain momentum rather than succumb to the middle income trap. However, the increasing numbers of empowered groups also hinder secondary policy development in certain areas. So that smart urban development, or CCS, that I talked about in mountains doesn't grow as fast here. And developments in these areas are only progressed later when resource stresses absolutely drive what would be seen as late responses. In energy terms, what does this look like? Energy supplies are tight, and commodity prices will rise. The price effects, those rising prices, unlock more expensive resources and push oil and gas developments into frontier environments like deep water and the Arctic. Liquid fuels and coal continue to play a leading role in the energy mix for transportation and are only displaced in the late term around 2070. In the late term when solar overtakes. So they play a role in transportation for a long time, and they play a role in the energy economy until late in this century. Natural gas grows moderately and really undershoots the development hopes that are now prevalent outside North America in countries like China. Greenhouse gas emissions peak and remain high for a very prolonged period until they're eventually reduced by the combination of biomass, carbon capture and storage, and solar power. Now, comparing these scenarios, we know they're shaped by very different political, economic, and social trajectories. In mountains, through existing influence, the pace of core institutional reform is slowed, and conversely, secondary areas of reform, like the smarter city development, are enabled or necessitated by having fewer power brokers. In oceans, core reforms are embraced and institutions reflect those changes. But growing numbers of vested interests hinder those secondary policy areas. For example, in CCS, it is delayed in oceans. Total primary energy consumption actually is similar for both outlooks. As you'll see on the slide, it grows. It grows 80%, 80, by the year 2050. The composition of the energy mix is very different. Gas is the backbone of mountains, and the long liquid fuels game plays in oceans, so more oil as we know it today. The similar overall energy consumption is the outcome of very different pressures. There's demand growth moderation in mountains that's accomplished through economic disappointments and energy-efficient infrastructures, and in oceans through high prices and end-use efficiency. The key differences in these scenarios are the trajectories for the resource mix, the resource volume, and environmental stresses. So let's talk about that for a second. First, the resource mix. Mountains and oceans lead to a shift in the sources of energy. In mountains, as you can see on the slide on the top bar, there's a dominance of biomass and then coal and then oil. And then that brings us to today. And then a transition to the largest source, to gas, natural gas becoming the largest source of energy in the 2030s. That's depicted by the green on the bar. In oceans, the transition to solar takes place late in the century, around 2070, preceded by a continued period of dominant oil and coal. In mountains, renewable energies continue to grow substantially, although renewables doesn't eclipse other fuels by 2060. Supply-demand tensions are a little bit more relaxed in mountains than they are in oceans. Oceans is a long liquids game because oil and biofuels play an important part in supplying transportation fuels until much later in the century. Their growth extends longer and the plateaus are higher than they are in the mountain scenario. In oceans, the strong economic growth stimulates renewable energy, and we project solar power will be the primary energy by around 2070. Now let's look at the resource volumes. So our analysis of more than 80 countries and 14 sectors of energy demand can be built up to a global summary of economic consumption that I show here. Total energy use from the beginning of the century to the middle roughly doubles in either scenario. This one is just oceans. It's the highest consumption scenario, and I show this one just in the interest of time. And because of that doubling in the energy demand, I'd submit to you that we're going to need more energy of all kinds, more oil, more coal, more natural gas, and more renewables. And if you look at the color on each of those bars, most of them indeed get bigger over time, not smaller. Gas will grow in mountains. Gas will be the largest fuel by 2050. It's not shown on here. There's a slide like this for mountains, but that green part will be the most dominant of the energy supply in mountains by 2050. Coal continues to remain significant in either scenario, and it grows in both scenarios. And in ocean, which is the most renewable-friendly scenario, solar dominates by 2060. Solar shown by that gold bar at the top. It's the biggest of any single energy source by 2060 by our predictions. In either scenario, renewables do not represent a majority, over 50% of the energy consumption in this time frame. If you're a young teenager right now, you may, and only may, see renewables eclipse fossil fuels by the end of your lifetime. Finally, let's take a look at an important issue. One measure of the environmental stress, there's many measures on water systems and food systems, but certainly one measure of environmental stress is its impact on the CO2 emissions profile. Here's the CO2 emissions profile for both mountains and oceans. First of all, focus on the 2-degree emissions pathway. That's the bar on the far right-hand side. That's the level to stay under or constrain atmospheric temperature increases and avoid the most serious effects of climate change, at least as posited by some scientists. Both scenarios right now, both oceans and mountains, overshoot the 2-degree pathway by some margin. Mountains is about 50% higher than the 2-degree pathway, and oceans is about 2 times as high. Mountains is lower because of the significant growth of natural gas, which displaces some coal growth, plus the early deployment of carbon capture and storage at a large scale. And just to avoid the mistaken conclusion that slower economic development in mountains is the main driver, one of the bars, the bar entitled Oceans Clean and Green, shows a sensitivity with ocean's economic dynamic, but with earlier deployment of carbon capture and storage and a higher availability of natural gas in the ocean scenario. And as you can see, we're still above the 2 degree Celsius line. The real message is around timing. Mountains isn't better in this context because CCS is deployed at scale 20 years earlier. The 2 degree pathway would require 20 years earlier still, but that means global penetration at a significant scale in the 2020s, which seems highly implausible. So some of what I showed you may be a combination of things. It may be provocative, depending upon your view, maybe a little bit surprising, but either way, I hope the information is of interest to you, because we do need fossil fuels, and we do need to mind emissions. We will absolutely need more renewables to fill the gap as well. So industry, academia, and where willing and even able, governments can come together to create solutions. That's what we're about here. That's what Michigan is about. So at this point, I've got a few minutes left, and I'd really love to take some questions from you, either on the scenarios or about the oil and gas business in general. Thank you.